What you're really asking is about how I'm involved in the Tom Thompson mystery and how I've created work that has to do with my connection to the North and Algonquin Park, Muskoka, and of course my uncle, Judge William Little, who wrote the book The Tom Thompson Mystery. And it was a book that he wrote in about 1970. And it had to do with research he'd been doing from his days as the music director at the Taylor-Staton camps in Algonquin Park. My background is that my family had a gorgeous property on Lake Rosso that was sold in the late 80s, actually. And I have to consider that perhaps the greatest loss in my life. And it signified to me so much that I am a nature person. Of course, as a visual artist, I was just really getting kind of off the ground in terms of landscape painting, landscape installation, and work that I was doing. By 2017, and I think we'll probably tell some of this story in pieces, it happened to be the 100th anniversary of Tom Thompson's death. So by about 2015, I think, I spoke to my very dear cousins, Sally, Jane, Tom, and John, whose father was my Uncle Bill, who wrote the Tom Thompson Mystery. And I said, the book's out of print, isn't it? Your dad's book. And they said yes. And I said, well, surely you own the rights to the book. I think it's time to republish it. And my rep at the time, Julie McMeekin, she had an art school called Art Embassy, and I should really preface that was an art gallery and art school, and she's a very, very dear friend, certainly to this day. And we were discussing a very large exhibition to produce. And we seemed to settle on the idea. I think I had been dealing with the idea of grieving the North, grieving High Pines. Some folks that follow me on Instagram know that my handle is High Pines Painter, and I've done many works sort of based on that subject matter, but it really goes deeper than that. So as I was feeling that I was grieving the loss of the North, it became evident that there was going to be quite a bit of work, information, things published, exhibitions, etc., based on the 100th anniversary of Tom Thompson's death. And I think what you've been asking, Pete, is a little bit of, maybe if I can translate this, you're asking a little bit about my uncle's history and how he became involved in this whole Tom Thompson narrative. If I can remember correctly, Uncle Bill was born, I think, about 1919. And by the 30s, he was working up at the Taylor-Staton camps. And those are these lovely camps on Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park. Just a stunning part of the province, a stunning part of the country, as many places are. But he was the music director at the Taylor-Staton camps. And even in those days, in the 30s, sure, you were looking after lots of kids and lots of activities, but there's not that much to do after the kids were asleep. So he started to get interested in the lore of Thompson. And in those days, in the 30s, all the players were still alive. So one of the key individuals was Mark Robinson, who was the park ranger in Algonquin Park at the time of Thompson's death. And in fact, he may have been, insofar as the park was concerned, maybe Thompson's best friend. And so my uncle began interviewing all the folks that figure into this narrative, including Shannon Fraser, who owned a place called Mowat Lodge. And Shannon Fraser was a kind of a prickly fellow, and he was Thompson's landlord. And let's see, who else was up there at the time? There was the Trainer cottage and the Trainer family, and there was a daughter named Winnie Trainer. And Winnie, I kind of feel this way about her, and I don't want to say anything, having never met her, having never known her. But I would suggest that she sort of, kind of impressed herself on Thompson. And I think it's more or less felt that he was a bit of a ladies' man. And primarily, he was a painter. Thompson would have met most of the group of 7 members working at Grip Advertising. But it really didn't suit him. He would have worked with J.H. MacDonald, Arthur Lismer, Varley, possibly Carmichael. I'm not sure about Casson, maybe. He would not have worked with Lorne Harris. Lorne Harris, who of course is part of the Massey Harris family, was independently wealthy, if you will, but a very, very sort of central person in terms of bringing the group of 7 together. And as most folks know, that the group of 7 was only formed after Thompson's death. So let's go back to what we were talking about, which was the folks that were present in Algonquin Park in the 30s when my uncle worked as the music director. So there was Shannon Fraser, that's the fellow who was Thompson's landlord. There was lovely Mark Robinson, the park ranger. We had the Winnie Trainer and her family. And then as far as my uncle's concerned, there was a family on Canoe Lake, I believe. I mean, all of those lakes are very much connected. Little Joe, Tiny Joe. I'm very much kind of making up some names to lakes now, but there is a Little Joe Lake up in Algonquin Park at this point. And Martin Bletcher was the son in the Bletcher family, and they were Germans. And interestingly, my uncle, who was involved as a flight instructor and in the Second World War, I think he maybe had a little bit of an edge. Perhaps I don't want to reference an axe to grind. I don't want to really be that sort of profound, but he really kind of implicates Martin Bletcher in the demise of Thompson. So my uncle just took it upon himself to interview all these people, and over the course of the summers that he was up there, and became really very, very curious about this enigmatic artist, Tom Thompson, who drowned at Canoe Lake, not in Canoe Lake. The medical evidence seems to indicate that Thompson died on dry land, not in the lake. When they found his body, what was noticed was that there was a little bit of blood coming out of his ears, and there was absolutely no water in his lungs. And the circumstances of his death were really very mysterious. The pertinent folk, in particular Shannon Fraser, indicates, now we're flipping back in time to 1917, that Shannon Fraser indicates that he saw, and I hope I'm remembering correctly as well too, he saw Thompson canoe away with his lovely dove gray canoe, packed up for a week or two of travels, food, etc., panels, oil paints, etc., and headed off in the canoe. If I am recalling correctly, and this is, everybody's welcome to read the Tom Thompson mystery, which is in reprint again and available. The idea that Thompson sort of sailed away or paddled, that's really, to be more correct about it, he apparently paddled away, and wasn't really seen that he headed off in a certain direction. And it just didn't sit right with a few folk. And as I'm sort of thinking through the narrative on this and explaining things, he was gone, I suggest, for about a week, and people started to worry. And then I believe the incident that happened that made folks very suspicious, Mark Robinson in particular, was that Thompson's beautiful dove gray canoe was found in Canoe Lake. I believe it was about a week later. So people became very, very concerned about what had happened to this young painter. Thompson was just in his mid-30s at the time. There was a family renting a cottage on Canoe Lake, And it was Dr. Howland and his family, including his wife and his young daughter. And the way Thompson's body was found was that Dr. Howland and his daughter, and Dr. Howland was a surgeon for a World War I surgeon, but back in Canada. And these dear soldiers that were coming back were just terribly wounded, blinded, lost limbs, before we had a diagnosis of PTSD. But these dear brave fellows were in terrible shape. And Howland was actually suffering essentially from PTSD. And I believe it was his psychiatrist that suggested he take the summer off and go with his family into Algonquin Park, which was really very sort of open. It had been logging territory, Algonquin Park, but it was kind of new as cottage country. So Dr. Howland and his daughter are out fishing in an evening about a week after, actually I think it's a little longer than a week, that Thompson had disappeared. And they were in a part of the lake that they knew reasonably well, and they got their fishing lines hooked on something. And I don't know if they caught a few little lake trout or what happened. They headed home, but in the morning, Thompson's bloated body was found floating in Canoe Lake. And the really suspicious element was that his I think it was his right ankle, was wrapped 17 times very carefully with fishing line, which likely at that point in time maybe would have been a type of gut or something, like an animal fiber. So we're talking over 100 years ago now. And that would indicate that he was purposely put into the lake and tied down, moored down either with rocks or, something, that he was meant literally to sleep with the fishes. There are other historians that think that may have indicated that he had a sprained ankle. However, if you're going to wrap fishing line around an ankle that carefully, that securely, that would amputate your foot eventually. That would cut off the circulation and amputate your foot. So when Thompson's body rises to the surface and it's discovered and it's in terrible condition, it's very bloated, folks are in extreme shock, and he's sort of gently pulled to one of the little islands in Canoe Lake, and his body is covered with a blanket. Now that blanket, I have no idea where that is, but if I just sort of interject a little bit with my own process in terms of being a visual artist, in particular with the story of Thompson, and my exhibition was titled Shadow Red. One of the things that I did was I chose to do, let's say, was I painted a number of the works on historic blankets. The reason being that Thompson was initially, when his body was found, he was covered in a blanket out of respect and heartbreak, I'm sure, by the people that cared for him and knew him. So we go back now. So we talked a little bit about the 30s, and now my uncle, and we're going to go to the year 1956. My uncle has several friends. He's working. I'm not even sure if my uncle was at that point was considered a judge, or called to be a judge. He was the first judge in the family court system that was not a lawyer by profession. So one of the things that Uncle Bill did was he gathered together a group of people that he knew. Leonard Gibbons, who was a local fellow, kind of a strong local fellow. A friend of his, Jack Eastaugh, who was a painter. And another fellow, Frank Brott. And Frank Brott was, I believe he was a high school principal in Guelph. My uncle had run the Guelph Reformatory for a few years. These four fellows on Thanksgiving weekend of 1956, made the pilgrimage up to the Taylor-Staton camps, and they were determined, I believe it was the Sunday, it might have been the Monday, it was either the Sunday or the Monday. They knew where the Canoe Lake Cemetery was. There is a bit of consecrated land up there, and they were determined to head up with shovels and see if they were going to find the body at Canoe Lake in the cemetery. Just describe how my work and my practice is kind of integrated, not kind of, but it's integrated and connected to my uncle. Well, there was a really kind of fateful day, that would have been in 2013, and I happened to be at an exhibition at the McMichael Art Gallery of Kim Dorland's work, and he was also looking into Thompson. He was looking into a number of the sort of narratives that, mysterious narratives about Canadian art history. Well, lo and behold, this very famous photograph of my uncle and the three men, the four diggers together, happened to be present in this exhibition on an iPad embedded into the wall. It was a really poignant day because one of my favorite people had just passed away, and I was taking literally, within an hour of the sighting of this iPad and of the photo of the diggers on this living iPad, turned on iPad, if you will, which is part of the exhibition. My aunt had just passed away, and you remember these things. You're just in a very raw state, and you feel that, okay, I'm being spoken to. Pay attention here. Now, I have never let go of painting landscape, and I'm very attached to where I live in the city. And interestingly, over the years, I've had many opportunities to live downtown. I'm lucky enough to have been mentored by one of the Painters 11 folk, a lovely guy, lovely artist named Tom Hodgson, brilliant abstract and portrait painter. I remember, this good grief, this is 40 years ago, that he offered me a beautiful apartment down on Shaw Street. It was just too far downtown for me. So most of my adult life, I have lived near the Don Valley. And over the years, I have started to see all kinds of animals. It really began in earnest with a beautiful gray wolf that ran across the road. One evening, my mother happened to be driving me home from something that we'd been doing together, and I saw this beautiful gray wolf run across the road in the sort of E.T. Seton Park area, the sort of Wicksteed area. If folks in Toronto, sorry to be Toronto-centric, know Laird Drive, south of Eglinton, it's part of the Don River, part of the Don River Basin. So that was the first animal that I saw, and my response to that animal was this gray wolf sculpture that I produced. And I use it a lot of the time to be a witness to the changes that are happening in the Don Valley. And in particular, one of my passions at this point is to support keeping the Ontario Science Centre in place where it is. So there are many, many animals that are also they're actually adding into this narrative, including human animals as well. I've begun to have a big interest in going back through maybe old Sotheby's, Ritchie's catalogs, and looking for artworks. And it started to occur to me, especially this happened during the pandemic, that there are a number of spots in the Don Valley that have been painted by the Group of Seven. And what did you get to do during the pandemic? It's how I spent my pandemic vacation. I started with bundle buggy and paints and a little chair, a little painter's chair, and headed off into the Don Valley and the nearby environs to paint bits of landscape, historic pieces, as well as working with a couple of photographers to document with Gray the wolf sculpture, some of these spots that have been painted historically, mostly about 100 years ago. Though there are many of us that live and work as artists that are working with this landscape. It's a very important landscape. it has to do with our water supply and essentially our lifeblood. It's a very important place. And one of the other connections to the Group of Seven would be that the studio building that was commissioned by, that would be Lauren Harris, J.E.H. MacDonald, and I believe also Dr. McCallum was involved. And Eden Smith was chosen as the architect to build the studio building, which most folks maybe think it's a hydro building or, a public works building, but you see it going south from the Rosedale subway station. It's on Severn Street, in very close to the Rosedale Valley Road. That location has 6 studios in it. The 6 studios have north-facing windows. I've been in a couple of them. Maybe I've been in about 3 or 4, actually. And they are double-storied studio spaces with a sort of a mezzanine with kind of like little bedrooms built in and small kitchens, and also lovely little fireplaces that are built on the diagonal. It's a very remarkable building. It's a very innocuous building. Was probably built certainly to budget, but it is extremely important in terms of Canadian art history, as it was a specifically built building to house artists. Now, Thompson and A.Y. Jackson weren't able to afford the rent, so they moved into the shack about a year or 2 later, and that shack, of course, has been relocated and extended, and it's on the McMichael property. So the studio building was very close to where Lauren Harris lived. I think it served probably as a site for the Group of 7 artists that lived. Some of them lived up in Thornhill, and that's just something that I've recently learned. But of course, if you follow down Rosedale Valley Road, you come very quickly to the Don River system. Today we think of it as where the Don Valley Parkway is, but the Don River system. And this was the thing that sort of clued me into, okay, there are a number of sites and there are a number of paintings, and you kind of find a familiarity with sites, light, location, time of day, depth of field, and began picking out sites along the Don River. I mean, there are beautiful little rapids along there. I'm certainly not trying to recreate in any way how the Group of 7 painted or where they painted, but there is an extreme comfort and pleasure in being a Canadian visual artist and tying myself to my home landscape. As I live just up, if folks know Toronto, I live sort of Davisville, Bayview area, and which is a short walk into something like Crother's Woods, which is a Carolinian forest, and I might even say was a Carolinian forest. It's being decimated by what's considered to be the Ontario line, trees that have never been, or an environment that has never been affected is now extraordinarily affected by this kind of, I'm going to refer to it as provincial destruction. That important day when I had a group of my adult students and we're up at the Michael, and it was a very, I was calling it a very emotional white knuckle day, and I saw this live iPad embedded into Kim Dorland's exhibition of this photograph of my uncle, which has become this major work called The Diggers. And I really took that as a little, I really needed kind of a crutch at that point. I mean, an emotional sort of spiritual crutch. And I still can visualize that right as I am speaking, that photograph, backlit, of course, speaking to me. And so at that was around the time I started to think about doing an exhibition that related to grief and loss. Probably that was because of my aunt's death, not my uncle's wife, but let's refer to her as a very close friend, Margaret's death that had happened that day in December of 2013. And this, sort of beam from my uncle. So in discerning what we were going to do next with my dear friend Julie McMeekin, my rep, and she's the owner of Art Embassy, we decided that this big exhibition could be placed in 2017, 100 years after the death of Thompson, but that it would deal with how I have grieved losing the North for me and how I've been recovering it in terms of my work, and also pay homage to my uncle. So the idea of working on unusual materials has always intrigued me. Some of the work that I produce, some of the landscape places that I go to are difficult to get to, and I often choose difficult materials to work with. I sometimes paint on velvet. I sometimes embroider, use beads and sequins and all kinds of things. That relates back to my costume set and set design work. But in this case, I began to think about the use of blankets for this major work that was going to be the centerpiece of this exhibition, Shadow Red. I have been archiving blankets, and I have always been interested in the Hudson's Bay Company. My attraction to blankets has to do also with the history and the narrative of Canada as a country, and both colonialism and the Indigenous culture and how they have mixed together, intersected together. And of course it isn't always a comfortable story, but it's something that we have to look at. The Hudson's Bay blankets, or trade blankets, were often infused with the smallpox virus, and this caused the decimation of the population, of the Indigenous population, in the most horrific way, in that you will often see scarring still on generations post the Indigenous trade and this smallpox outbreak. This was decided by the British military, that this was a good idea to infuse the blankets with this virus. It's a despicable part of our history, but it's there, and it's important to say or talk about. The other thing about a wool blanket is that it is often kept people warm and allowed settlers in particular, well, settlers and Indigenous people, to survive in the cold. These beautiful wool blankets, I believe they're made in either England or Scotland. You see them historically wrapped around Indigenous peoples, and you see what's known as a capote, which is a type of a coat with a hood and a belt, no buttons. It's a very simple coat form. You see that, for instance, in the painting of James Lefroy by Paul Kane. And so I've always been a bit of a sort of a history buff, if you will, but I started to kind of archive these blankets. And so when it came time to produce this big major work for Shadow Red, I chose 4 different blankets. So I took that photograph of my uncle and the 3 other fellows, and I had to sort of separate it apart, expand the landscape just a little bit. That photograph, of course, is taken at Canoe Lake, likely the day after the diggers, the 4 men, discovered the Tom Thompson's remains. And so I chose for Leonard Gibbons a camp blanket, that gray with I think it's a navy blue stripe. For my uncle, I chose a Kenwood blanket, which was a blanket company that was based in Ontario, made blankets for the war effort. Sadly doesn't exist any longer. My uncle, because he was sort of the inset for this, is on a gold blanket. Jack Eastaugh, the painter, is on a green Hudson's Bay point blanket. And Frank Brott is on a Bird's woolen mill blanket, which is a 2-sided blanket. I chose the blue side for Frank Brott. The other side is kind of a pinky sort of yellow color. And Bird's Woolen Mill was a blanket factory based in Bracebridge, so in the area, almost in Algonquin Park, if you will. So each of these panels is 72 inches by 24 inches. And I originally planned to paint the 4 men in full color. And I was doing the underpainting essentially in a sort of a black gesso, and I had a couple of curators look at it, and they said, just stop. And I was beginning to think, yeah, I think I should stop. I don't want to make this garish. I want to make this honorable and solemn. And I also wanted to refer a little bit to black and white photography.